Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome to our scholar session this evening. My name is Emma. I'm the membership coordinator here at President Lincoln's Cottage. First, I want to say thank you all for joining us tonight, particularly our Team Lincoln members, whose annual gifts help us preserve the cottage and make member programs and programs like this possible. If this event and similar ones are of interest to you, or if you need to renew your membership, you can become a member of Team Lincoln right on our website, and we'll send a link in the chat. In addition to supporting our mission, members receive a variety of benefits such as discounted tour tickets, early and discounted access to special events like this one, and discounts in our museum shop and more. We will be saving questions for the end following Carole's presentation. So if everyone could just stay muted throughout it, that would be awesome. You can send your questions in the chat and I'll ask them at the end during the Q&A portion. Now I'm going to turn it over to our CEO and Executive Director, Kelly Hawkins.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you all for coming to our scholar session tonight with Carole Adrienne to discuss her book, Healing a Divided Nation. Carole received her BFA from Moore College of Art and Design and is not only an author, but also a documentary filmmaker. I'm convinced after our brief conversation that there's nothing she can't do. She has served on advisory panels for the Philadelphia Archdiocese Historic Research Center, the Mutter Museum's Civil War Medicine exhibit, and their exhibit on the 1918 flu epidemic. She is currently working on a documentary film series on Civil War medicine. In Healing a Divided Nation, Carole tracks healthcare's remarkable transformation throughout the Civil War within its cultural and historical context, illustrating how the advancements made in these 4 years reverberated throughout the Western world for years to come. Utilizing primary source texts that document the lives of those who pioneered these transformations, the story that ensues is one of American innovation and resilience in the face of unparalleled violence, adding a new dimension to the legacy of the Civil War. So, Carole, thank you so much for joining us here tonight, and thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you so much. I am really privileged to be here and share this wonderful story with you tonight. We're going to talk about Healing a Divided Nation, How the American Civil War Revolutionized Western Medicine, which is a book that I was offered the opportunity to write while I was working on producing a 4-part series called Civil War Medicine. So this came right in the middle, and it really allowed me to delve even deeper into the stories of some of the extraordinary people who made this happen. So we're going to talk about Civil War medicine in Washington, D.C. today. And I wanted to share this picture of the Capitol, domeless, but this was an image that people who lived in the city were used to seeing during the Civil War years. The Capitol was enlarged and a new dome was ordered for it. So the work was begun in 1856 and completed in 1866. And the new dome was made of iron. And if you're curious, it cost $1,047,291 in those years, which would be equivalent to about $38 or $39 million today. But since we are here at President Lincoln's Cottage, I want to respectfully acknowledge that President Lincoln's Cottage stands on the traditional unceded lands of the Piscataway people, who maintain an abiding relationship with the territory west of the Chesapeake Bay. I also acknowledge that much of Washington was built by enslaved African Americans. So looking at this lovely, peaceful scene of this beautiful little building, it's an extraordinary place in many senses. And one of the most important is that President Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation at this location. The Emancipation Proclamation is probably one of the most important documents in human history. On January 1st, 1863, during the American Civil War, the proclamation changed the legal status of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans. It changed their legal status from enslaved to free. Lincoln had some very interesting things and deep thoughts about this situation. I just want to share a couple of his quotes about this situation. He said, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves." And he also said, "Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally." So President Lincoln was a fascinating, brilliant, interesting, and interested person. His contributions to our society, our culture, technology, and management are still part of our daily lives. So today we're going to take a look at Lincoln's hand in the medical impact of the Civil War and also in the impact created by some of the medical personnel, not necessarily in a medical sense, but also impacted our entire culture. Well, Lincoln had a checkered past medically. He was kicked in the head by a horse at age 9, and he was unconscious for hours. His family was not sure whether he would awaken, and fortunately for our world, he did. He suffered throughout his life with depression, and actually the Lincoln family was rather well known for having a history of depression throughout that family. Now, there's another situation that Lincoln endured that is attributed most likely to one of two genetic conditions. This is owing to the structure, the cranial structure of his face, and also the large hands that he had. So different physical issues give rise to the suspect that he had Marfan syndrome or Marfan disease, or a condition called multiple endocrine neoplasia type 2B. He suffered at least 2 bouts of malaria, and in 1863 he was struck by smallpox. Well, this extraordinary man came in contact with 1 million casualties of the war. Now, Civil War medicine usually conjures up images of amputations, of outdoor surgeries, of piles of amputated limbs, of terrible suffering and death. Now, all of these things are true, but this is a true story about Americans at their best. This is about the incredible heroes of Civil War medicine, Black, white, men, women, Northern, Southern, who ministered to the wounded and sick of both armies. It is a story of incredible compassion and kindness and action on the part of tens of thousands of Americans. They not only took care of these grievously wounded soldiers and these critically ill people, but they moved the field of medicine light years from where it had been. These are the people Lincoln's referring to when he talked about the better angels of our nature. Well, the huge death toll of the Civil War, estimated at between 650,000 and 750,000, is more than the death total of World Wars I, II, and Vietnam combined. This was huge. And it can be traced really to 2 causes: weapons and disease. Well, at the time the Civil War started, it's hard to believe, but possibly as many as 300 doctors in the entire country had witnessed surgery or seen a gunshot wound in a human. The medicine of 1860 was almost identical to the medicine of 1760, although the weapons had advanced wildly in technology. So let's talk a little bit about that. I want to take you on a crash course through what these medical workers were up against. Let us start with gunpowder, the genesis of modern weapons. Gunpowder was actually invented in China in the 10th century by a group of Taoist monks. One of the great ironies of this story is that they were inventing it as a substance, a medication to extend the length of human life. So gunpowder is made of potassium nitrate, which is also known as saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. Once they had created this substance, well, it wasn't lengthening life, but it turned out to be explosive, and it was a propellant. So this spurred the creative neurons of many people to begin creating weapons that utilize these two qualities. So we get fire lances as the first gunpowder propelled weapons. Basically, it was gunpowder wrapped in pieces of paper or fabric with a fuse strapped to an arrow and let fly. Well, over the next several centuries, there were huge advancements made in weapons. So when we jump a few centuries ahead, we're talking about muskets, also known as rifles, long guns, shoulder guns. This is the Springfield Model 1861, which was the single most popular weapon at the beginning of the Civil War. So most of the Union soldiers were using this gun, and they were proud of it. It was a beautifully engineered thing. The barrel of this gun was smooth inside. It fired a round ball known as a musket ball, usually made from poured lead or sometimes from stone. It was wrapped in a piece of fabric and inserted into this long barrel, pushed down with a long, slim tool called a ramrod. So this weapon could fire 1 round a minute. If you were really good and you could do that loading process more quickly, you could fire 2 rounds a minute. It was a very popular weapon, and it did a lot of damage, but it was superseded rather quickly by some new developments. Now, in the middle, you see a classic musket ball. On either side, although the shape is of a bullet, these are called mini balls. This was ammunition that was invented by a French army officer, Carole Adrienne, and they were cast in lead. They were hollow base, but the most important feature were the grooves you see at the bottom of the projectile. They began to groove the inside of the rifle barrels. So between the grooved bullets and the grooved barrels, they locked in better. And so upon leaving that barrel, they were more accurate, the trajectory was better, and the speed. This really revolutionized ammunition. And actually, most bullet wounds during the Civil War were caused by these mini balls. They very quickly outpaced the musket ball. So things began to advance, and a lot of people tried to create a repeating rifle. Christopher Minor Spencer of Connecticut was the first one to come up with a really reliable repeating rifle. You see them here. The one on top is shorter. That's a carbine, and it was developed for use by the cavalry because those long guns were really difficult to carry on horseback. Now, Christopher Spencer came down from Connecticut with his new repeating rifle to show to President Lincoln, and he brought it to the White House to exhibit to the president, as one does. And Lincoln, who was fascinated by anything technical, scientific, mechanical, he was really, in the nicest sense of the word, a techno geek. And I say that in an admiring way. Well, when he saw this gun, he had to fire it. Even though the law in Washington, D.C. was that no weapons could be fired within the city limits, but Lincoln was the president. So I guess he knew he would get away with it. And he and a naval aide and Christopher Spencer took the gun to a little park across from the White House. They had a very crude pine target. So Lincoln shot this gun to his heart's content. He was profoundly impressed, and he ordered it examined by the Army and the Navy, both of whom were very impressed with it, and soon thousands of the Spencer repeating rifles were delivered to Union troops. When they got back to the White House, President Lincoln gifted Christopher Spencer, the inventor, with a piece of the pine target that they had been shooting with, which kind of says to me that Lincoln understood superstardom and souvenirs. So now we've gone within a space of about 2.5 years from weapons that fired 1 round a minute to a weapon that could fire 20 rounds a minute. And then came the Gatling gun. Now this weapon had 6 rifle barrels attached to a metal cylinder that was cranked by hand. And as you can see, it was easy to move around, it was easy to aim, and it fired 200 rounds a minute. So we went from 1 round a minute to 20 to 200 rounds a minute. This weapon changed the face of battle and of warfare. It was the great-granddaddy of every assault rifle. It just was a remarkable invention. And one of the extraordinary things about it was invented by a medical doctor. This is Richard Jordan Gatling, MD. He was another young inventor, brilliant. Now his field was agriculture, and he invented a lot of devices to make planting of crops easier and more efficient. He caught smallpox at age 28 while on a business trip. And when he recovered, which he fortunately did, he decided he wanted to go to medical school. So he attended medical school in Ohio and earned his MD degree, even though afterward he found that he preferred inventing to doctoring. But when the Civil War began and he saw the young men returning broken or dead from the battles and sick, he was horrified by it. And that is when he invented the Gatling gun. And this is why, this is a letter that he wrote to a friend to explain it. He said, "It occurred to me that if I could invent a machine, a gun, which could by rapidity of fire enable 1 man to do as much battle duty as 100, that it would to a large extent supersede the necessity of large armies, and consequently exposure to battle and disease be greatly diminished." He thought he was going to end war with the development of the Gatling gun. Well, in addition to all of these highly advanced weapons that came into use, soldiers faced the diseases. These were just some of the common diseases of the Civil War, from pneumonia through diarrhea and dysentery, which killed thousands of men, to what were known as the classic childhood diseases. Measles, chickenpox killed so many young guys. And they noticed that the soldiers who had grown up in rural areas were much more susceptible to disease than the guys who had grown up in cities and towns and had developed stronger immunities. So the only of all this list, the only disease for which there was inoculation available was smallpox, which is an interesting story all on its own. And I hope you'll read my book because we go into that. But it was just between the weapons and the diseases, it was pretty much of a horror story. So I want to take you to what the situation was in Washington, D.C. Oh, well, let's just look at the pharmaceuticals first. I'm sorry. The quinine and opium were the 2 most effective and widely available in the North pharmaceuticals. So quinine, actually, it's made from the bark of the cinchona tree, which grows in South America, and we believe it was brought to this continent by Jesuit priests. So sometimes it was called Jesuit's bark or cardinal's bark. But quinine was really valuable for treatment of malaria, which it had been used for many years in South America. In fact, quinine was used for the treatment of malaria into the 21st century. There are now synthetic drugs available, but this was the one that really was always the standard bearer. And then opium, which was a painkiller, if you look at the over-the-counter pharmaceuticals of the Civil War period, just about everything has opium in it. And what happened, as well as killing the pain, was that it created a huge number of addicts. And after the Civil War, it was called Old Soldiers' Disease. We don't have any numbers on how many people died after the war from disease or wounds they had incurred during the war, but there were plenty people who were addicted to opium. Well, they did have anesthesia. They had ether and chloroform. And both of them were effective in keeping a patient completely insensible for the 9 minutes it took to amputate a limb. Now, ether was bulky and very flammable. And these drugs were originally administered by soaking a cloth and placing it over the nose and mouth of the patient. But ether, they were using it in tents made of wood and fabric that were lit by candles or torches. So ether was a pretty dangerous thing, although used very commonly throughout the war. The other anesthesia was chloroform, which was less bulky and less flammable, but had the unfortunate side effect of occasionally killing in an instant. And they described it as they believed that the heart or the lungs actually froze with the administration of chloroform. So it was a pretty iffy situation. Well, let's take a look at the background of what was going on in the landscape of the city of Washington, D.C. at this point of time and the devastating conditions that were appearing by 1861. This is the first Battle of Bull Run in Manassas, Virginia. After this battle, thousands of soldiers of both armies lay on that field for up to a week. There was no such thing as ambulance service in America. It hadn't been thought of. There were no hospitals waiting to receive the wounded. It was amazing the people who did survive. So I want to give you some appreciation of the extraordinary and heroic measures that were provided by people, largely volunteers. And this is where disaster relief and crisis management come to Washington, D.C. This picture, which I personally call the surgical waiting room, which is really pretty much what it is. And this is a scene repeated in untold numbers of areas across our country. These are soldiers who have likely been wounded in a limb and are awaiting amputation to save their lives in a situation where there were hastily erected tents, sheds that were taken over for surgical operations. But here they are waiting to lose a limb and hopefully save their lives. Well, refugees began flooding into Washington, D.C. These were wounded and sick soldiers, freed and escaped slaves, poor whites seeking protection and food and medical care. It was a wild situation with large numbers of people coming into the city, carrying whatever they had, whatever small belongings with them. And with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, even more freed slaves came to Washington. People didn't know what to do, how to survive in a post-war environment. And this is a contraband camp in Washington, D.C. This is an original Civil War photograph. Contraband was a term usually applied to escaped slaves. It's an ugly word implying stolen property. Well, with no buildings to accept these people, they made tent cities, which were frequently mud cities, which lasted all 4 years of the war and after. It was just a devastating situation and very difficult. Now, in Washington, D.C. at the time, there was one building that was called a hospital. It was a brick building, 2 stories, 6 rooms, and it really was used just for isolating smallpox patients. They were aware of the danger of contagion, although they didn't know how to stop it for the most part. Anyway, the military co-opted that building. It became the first military hospital to be established in the Civil War. And they began to extemporize public and private buildings for use as hospitals. Now, this is a church actually in Northern Virginia in a very typical situation. Many churches were extemporized. Now, you can see they got this kind of down to a science. It was easier to go in and put planks across the top of the pews, which you can see here. So they basically made a second level of flooring and just moved beds in. And most of the churches could handle at least 100 wounded. Some could handle 200. But this is a church right in Washington, the 8th Street Methodist Church. It served as a hospital during the war. It handled about 100 patients at a time. And even the United States Capitol served as a hospital in the rotunda for several weeks in 1862. This is a painting by Alan Cox. It's oil on canvas. It is part of the murals in the Capitol building currently, and it depicts probably pretty reliably how they set up the rotunda to handle all these wounded soldiers. The U.S. Patent Office also served as a hospital throughout the war. It's a very large building. And it was a temporary barracks and morgue as well. This is the interior shot of the Patent Office Hospital, one of the wards. Now, in Georgetown, the Union Hotel served as a hospital. And this one is interesting in that the author, Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women and many other books for young people, she volunteered as a nurse and she served for 6 weeks in the Georgetown Union Hotel Hospital until she contracted typhoid. She became very ill and she really never fully recovered. She suffered for the rest of her life because the medications with which she was treated were pretty much mercury based, and Louisa May Alcott died at 55 of acute mercury poisoning. Now, Douglas Hospital is an interesting one. You see on the left, these are 3 very large townhomes, mansions really, that belonged to prominent politicians in Washington. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, Vice President John Breckinridge of Kentucky, and Senator Henry Rice of Minnesota owned these 3 buildings. Now, I found conflicting stories as to whether the government seized these homes for use as a hospital or whether they were offered these homes for use as a hospital. We're not sure, but they did serve as a hospital for most of the war. Now, Campbell General Hospital was another case of extemporizing buildings made for something different. This was originally constructed as a barracks for the cavalry. Very large. It was one of the hospitals where the poet and journalist Walt Whitman did volunteer work for several years during the war. And Campbell Hospital is also unique in that it provided nightly entertainment for the patients. Now, the assassin John Wilkes Booth had learned that President Lincoln was invited and planning to be at Campbell Hospital on March 17th, 1865, for a performance of Still Waters Run Deep. Booth arranged for an ambush, although Lincoln's plans changed at the last moment. His schedule was different, and the plot was postponed until the following month. Well, with all these buildings that were intended for other uses, the governments really had to come up with how to build new hospitals to handle the tens of thousands of patients. So both North and South independently decided to adopt hospital plans that had been successfully used in France and England. So this is Lincoln General Hospital, one of the largest military hospitals in Washington, D.C., and this is a pavilion hospital. So you see the long, narrow wooden buildings, which had good ventilation, supplies, patients, personnel moved much more smoothly through these buildings. And usually it was a large expanse that would be fitted out with quarters for the medical staff, laundry, and other facilities like a morgue, but it was very much more efficient. Now, this is the V plan of a pavilion hospital. This is another one, Harewood Hospital. They're such beautiful images, I realize, for something so sad, but this is another V-shaped hospital. Now we begin to get the very first specialty hospitals happening. And in Washington, D.C., there was a mansion at the corner of 14th Street and Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, known as the Hill Mansion, which was used as a specialty hospital. It was the Des Marais Hospital for Eye and Ear. So you start to get hospitals corresponding to large numbers of similar wounds that were occurring. Now, this is the contraband hospital and camp. And as you can see, so this is for the use of formerly enslaved people and free blacks. This was, just the number of people needing this kind of help and the paucity of the facilities and personnel available to help them was really stark. But it was something where people pitched in from all parts of the North, and in the South they did too. But this was really the first of its kind at this contraband hospital. So the surgeon in charge for quite a while was one of the people I am most admiring of in this story, just Alexander Thomas Augusta, MD. So Alexander Augusta was born in the state of Virginia to free parents. He was very bright, and we're not sure how, but he made contact somehow with the physicians or saw them working when he was little, and he just knew that was what he wanted to do. Now, he was really hampered by this because Virginia and some other southern states had what were called literacy laws, or more accurately, anti-literacy laws. If you were a person of color in Virginia or some of the other states, it was illegal for you to learn to read and write. And there were harsh penalties for anyone of color who achieved literacy, and extremely harsh penalties for anyone helping them to learn. So when he became a young man, Alexander Augusta moved to Baltimore, Maryland, where things were not as rigid or threatening. He worked as a barber, and he was able to quietly hire some people to teach him to read and write. Well, he was a natural, brilliant student, and he achieved full literacy very quickly. And then he thought, okay, now I'm going to medical school. Well, he applied to American medical schools, including the University of Pennsylvania, and he was rejected by all of them owing to the color of his skin. So Dr. Augusta went to Canada, to Toronto, where he and his wife were not only welcomed, but respected. He was accepted into the medical school there, and he opened a pharmacy and a drugstore to support his medical education, his wife and himself. He was in school there for 6 years. When he graduated, the dean called him brilliant. So Dr. Augusta went into private practice, but very shortly thereafter, he was tapped to become the head of the Toronto City Hospital. So you know he had to be good. He really was. This man had a list of firsts longer than your arm. It was pretty amazing. Well, when the Civil War broke out in America, Dr. Augusta wrote to President Abraham Lincoln, and he offered his services to treat the black soldiers who were becoming a large part of the Union Army. Well, first Lincoln said yes, and Congress said no, and back and forth for weeks. And finally, they said, yes, come. So Abraham Lincoln commissioned Alexander Augusta as an officer in the Union Army for the first time for an African-American man, and Dr. Augusta proudly donned the Union uniform. Well, here's another instance of differences made by the medical personnel, not necessarily of a medical nature or clinical, but they changed everything. In 1862, Dr. Augusta, in full Union uniform, was on a streetcar in Washington, D.C. It was pouring rain, and he was, of course, trying to stay inside out of the rain. Well, the white passengers in the car were trying to push him off onto the platform or off the streetcar completely, which was a horrible experience. He was enraged, and he wrote another letter to President Lincoln asking for protection for African American families on public transportation in the city of Washington, D.C. Well, that letter made its way to a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner. And Senator Sumner was enraged as well, and he took action. Well, he took it to Congress, and by March 1865, Congress passed legislation making racial discrimination on public transportation in the city of Washington, D.C. illegal. Well, Dr. Augusta went on to have more firsts. He became the first Black head of an American hospital. He became the first Black faculty member of a university medical school, and here he is at Howard University. And when he passed away, he was the first African American officer to be interred at Arlington National Cemetery. Well, let's talk about the women. Now, American women at this point in our history were expected to provide the picture of sentimental domesticity. They were supposed to be prim, proper, pious, modest, weak, and dependent. The only job outside of the home for women that was regarded as a respectable work was teaching. Women did not do nursing other than for members of their immediate family. It was regarded as very improper for them to venture into nursing or, contacting the bodies of other people who were not members of their immediate family. Well, fortunately for the American women, something had happened a few years before in England, which was going to help them. This is Florence Nightingale. She was a brilliant young woman with a heck of a great education, homeschooled, but heavily and profoundly. She was a natural data analyst and statistician. She had a tremendous interest in healthcare, and she had a lot of private theories about it. So when she grew up, she really pursued that. She went to Germany to meet with people who were involved with public health care there, and she just had all these ideas. Well, when Britain got into a war in Crimea, she traveled there as a volunteer. When she got there, the building designated as a hospital was devoid of beds, medicine, food, ventilation, and it had thousands of wounded soldiers, and it was awash in filth. Florence Nightingale's moment had come, and she jumped on it. She had that place cleaned out. She had the windows opened. She had beds brought in, got the patients off the floor. She made sure that meals were delivered on a schedule, that medications were given on schedule, and the death rate in that hospital dropped dramatically. Well, when Florence went back to England, she started the first school of nursing. And she wrote a book called Notes on Nursing, which is still in print today. She really changed the face of, she's regarded as really the originator of skilled nursing care. So the only group of women in the United States who had had any experience in terms of care of the sick were the Catholic nuns. In Europe, for a long time, the religious nuns and monks really handled the indigent, the dying, the chronically ill, poor. They were the ones who took care of them, but that was not the situation in America, except for some of the Catholic nuns who had learned from Florence Nightingale or about her. And it was a period very difficult for them. These women did not like to go out of the convents in their habits because they were harassed and sometimes attacked. It was a very hostile situation since the 1840s. A group called the Know Nothings, or the nativists, who were anti-immigration, had riots and church burnings in Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore, Louisville, Cincinnati. Huge, horrible riots. This is a church in Philadelphia, St. Michael's in Kensington, the Kensington area of the city, which was burned in 1844. So this was really a violent and hateful situation for Catholic nuns. But they were the only women who really knew what to do. So who are you going to call? Well, President Lincoln requested aid from the Catholic Sisterhood, and it is estimated that between 600 and 800 nuns served as nurses during the Civil War. They were 20% of all the nuns in the country, really, and they became beloved by the patients and also the doctors. They asked for very little for themselves. They were willing to work crazy long hours. They would treat patients with known communicable diseases, and many of them would treat patients who were white or black. So in a rather stunning reversal, this is something that would not have been seen 3 years before. But you see these hated nuns suddenly depicted. This is Harper's Weekly, one of the two weekly tabloids in the country. And the nuns are depicted as angelic healers, beloved angelic healers. So it changed everything. And in 1924, the city of Washington, D.C. erected the Nuns of the Battlefield Monument at the Cathedral of St. Matthew. I want to read you the inscription. This is a very large four-sided monument by the Irish artist Jerome Connor. And this is the inscription. They comforted the dying, nursed the wounded, carried hope to the imprisoned, gave in his name a drink of water to the thirsty. To the memory and in honor of the various orders of sisters who gave their services as nurses on battlefields and in hospitals during the Civil War. Well, another unusual woman who served was that rare creature, a medical doctor, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker from New York State, who got her degree at Syracuse. She was a feminist and a suffragist, and she served as a surgeon for the Union Army. She was taken prisoner and held behind enemy lines, and it is widely suspected that she served as a spy for the Union as well. She was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Andrew Johnson in November of 1865. This is the Medal of Honor, which it comes to us from the Civil War. It was created in 1861. It is our nation's highest military award for bravery. So it was developed for the Navy, and the following year, 1862, one was developed for the Army. Well, one of the unusual things here is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker wearing her Congressional Medal of Honor. To date, in this year of 2024, she is the only woman ever to have been awarded this honor. Well, extraordinary women in Washington, D.C. included Dorothea Lynn Dix. She was the first woman really to serve in a high-level federally appointed position. She was somebody who had tremendous impact on Western nursing and healthcare, although she was not a nurse herself. Dorothea came from a really dysfunctional family and a very unhappy childhood and poor health. but she had a real passion for education and for disseminating information. Well, she was sent to Europe to combat her poor health, and there she met activists who were part of reform groups lobbying for the humane treatment of the insane. This was something that it just spoke to her. And when she came back to America, she traveled all over the country. She visited prisons, hospitals, and insane asylums. And the conditions, people were treated worse than animals. It was horrible. And she almost really kind of single-handedly transformed the care of mental illness in America. So at the beginning of the Civil War, she was no kid. She was 59 years old. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to talk with the Secretary of War about what she might contribute. He was very impressed with her, Simon Cameron, and he appointed her the superintendent of Union Army nurses. This was a post that she held throughout the war. She appointed and arranged for the training of more than 3,000 nurses. That was about 15% of all Union Army nurses. She had very high standards. She took great care of her nurses. Sometimes she was known as Dragon Dix. She was not the least difficult person personally, but she had a huge heart and she was action-based. So before and after the war, she really lobbied Congress and the state legislatures to establish designated hospitals for the treatment of the mentally ill. And in Washington, D.C., she founded the Government Hospital for the Insane. It became known as St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And at the start of the Civil War, it was the only federal mental health facility in the country. Now, St. Elizabeth's Hospital is still in use as a psychiatric hospital in Washington, D.C. And Dorothea Dix was instrumental in the founding of more than 30 mental health facilities in the United States and some in other countries. Another woman with huge honors and influence in Washington, D.C. was Clara Barton, Clarissa Harlow Burton. She was born in Massachusetts, very bright and very shy girl. Her brother David suffered some severe injuries. They were having a barn raising and he fell from the rafters and was really badly injured. And Clarissa, who was a child herself, spent 2 years taking care of him. And interestingly, David Barton did recover and he served as an assistant quartermaster in the Union Army. So it's nice to know that part had a happy ending. Well, Clara's mother, it was suggested to her mother that because her daughter was so shy, that she have her trained as a teacher to combat the shyness. Well, Clara became a very popular teacher and she went to work at a school. Well, at some point, a man teacher was hired and she discovered that he was being paid twice her salary. She was furious. She said she would never again work for less than a man. And she up and moved to Washington, D.C. And she was hired at the patent office as a clerk. She was their first female clerk. She took a lot of heat for that. But she was paid $1,400 annually, the same as the men were paid. Well, after some serious opposition, she did go home to Massachusetts. But when President Abraham Lincoln was elected, she went back to Washington and she went back to the patent office as a copyist. So she offered to do 2 jobs for 1 salary so that another man could be released to serve in the army. But her offer was refused. She resigned and she decided to dedicate herself to the relief effort. Now, sometimes you see Clara Barton referred to as a nurse, but she never referred to herself that way. She always called herself a relief worker. She began to gather supplies. For Washington was just flooded with newly recruited troops who had uniforms but no bedding, who were hungry. Many of them were already wounded. And she collected and distributed supplies. She got permission from the government. Clara Barton driving some of her own wagons, and this again is an original photograph, so this was a very typical wagon. She delivered supplies to Antietam and to every battlefield in Virginia, South Carolina, and Maryland. She, at one point, she was helping a wounded soldier on the field, and a bullet came past. It tore through the sleeve of her dress. It killed her patient, but it didn't hurt her. When they set up the battles, you may know this, they really kind of made a date for it. So you could move in supplies and artillery before the battle actually started. And she was passionate about helping these men. Well, although Clara and President Lincoln never met face to face, he was very aware of her work and kind of followed it. And in 1865, he put her in charge of the Office of Correspondence of Missing Men. So in her capacity here, starting in 1865, she answered 63,000 letters about missing soldiers. She used her own funds to set up this office, and she was able to locate 22,000 men or their graves from the Union Army. She testified repeatedly before Congress. She testified about the conditions at the Andersonville prison in Georgia, one of the most horrible plights that prisoners went to. She testified about the problems of freed slaves who had no idea or instruction on how to survive in the post-slavery landscape. Well, Clara, after a few years after the war, she took a trip to Europe that really fueled her humanitarian heart and efforts. She met the people who were setting up the precursor to the International Committee of the Red Cross. That really spoke to her. Also, she was very much in favor of the original Geneva Convention of 1864, which one of the primary goals was the neutrality of the wounded and their caretakers in times of war. Very, very important. Well, it took years to convince the American government about both these things. And she, in 1882, President Chester Arthur finally signed the Geneva Convention, made America a member. But she had to wait until 1900 for the Congressional Charter of the American Red Cross. And she served for years as its president. And when she died, her Maryland home was designated as a National Historic Site in 1975. And it was the first site in America to be designated so to the achievements of a woman. Well, there's another person from Lincoln's life that I want to introduce you to. This is William, Red Cross, we got it. William Henry Johnson worked for Abraham Lincoln in Illinois, part-time in different capacities. And I would have to say, from everything, it seems to me they became great friends and that Lincoln trusted and loved this man. So when Lincoln was inaugurated, Johnson traveled to Washington with him and then to Gettysburg, where Lincoln was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. Well, Lincoln's son Tad had contracted smallpox, and it's estimated that Lincoln probably was infected by his contact with his son, and he was experiencing symptoms on the train on the way to Gettysburg. Well, he managed to get there, deliver the speech, and William Johnson nursed Lincoln through this bout of smallpox, and he contracted it himself after the trip to Gettysburg. This is the best picture I could find of William Henry Johnson, Lincoln's valet. So he became sick afterward, and he was sick for several months and actually went into hospital the following January, where he died. And Lincoln, when he passed away, Lincoln co-guaranteed the mortgage on the house Johnson had bought in Illinois for his family, and he arranged and paid for his burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Well, Lincoln was an extraordinary man who inspired and encouraged and adapted. He exhibited incredible compassion. And I wondered if he were speaking to us today, to Americans, in this year, in this time that we are now in, what would he say of his many quotes and writings? And I think it might have been this one: the ballot is stronger than the bullet. Thank you so much for joining me. Happy to answer questions, and I hope you'll read my book and learn more about these incredible people who came before us and showed us the best of Americans. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. If anybody has any questions, if you want to put them in the chat and then I can read them out. First question, do you know where the tent cities were located? I know you mentioned one at the Boundary Street, but
I don't know exactly. I think some of them were 7th Street, but I'm sorry, I'm not positive on that one. Does anybody else know out there? I will be Googling later. I'm sorry, I know where everything else was, but not the tent cities, because I think they did spring up in various, anywhere you had ground and you could set up tents. I don't think there really was just the one.
absolutely. Another question that I was thinking of, I'm sure like a lot of the research you were going through was pretty grim and gruesome. And I was wondering where you found sort of hope in these stories.
It was really through the people and the fact that they worked through these horrible conditions. I mean, if you can imagine, they sometimes would have 2,000 people waiting for life-saving surgery after a battle, or more than that. And most of those doctors, what got me was a lot of those doctors were medical students who had had 1 or 2 years of lectures, and all of a sudden they were in this tumult of blood and death and horror, and they operated holding candles and torches. I mean, I think it just spoke to me that they persevered, that they had compassion, and that the sides weren't working together. But like after Gettysburg, there were 5,000 Confederate wounded left on the field, and the Union took care of them. And other times when guys were captured, that when in the South, then when there were Union soldiers captured, there were Confederate soldiers who operated on them. I think there was a feeling of compassion and brotherhood almost in that a wounded man was a wounded man, and you treated him. So I think these were people where the entire cultural and societal structure of the country changed with the advent of women and African Americans coming into business and the medical field. And their strength just spoke to me. I read an awful lot of firsthand accounts, and that was some amazing tenacity and bravery.
Absolutely. Someone in the chat said, thank you for mentioning Dr. Augusta and Dr. Walker. They are 2 unknowns that really made a difference in difficult circumstances of the day. I want to make sure you saw that.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Someone said, can you tell us more about the project you're working on, about your book? The book, The Healing a Divided Nation, is available. It was written or came out in 2022, but I'm not sure if that is about your documentary project that I know you have.
It is. Well, the documentary project really came first. So I've spent almost 5 years in an incredible number of repositories and archives and libraries and specialty libraries and private collections, um, researching it because I had never seen anything extensive. Now, I know some people get a little disappointed that I'm not talking about amputations and the clinical aspect of it, but the clinical aspect has been really studied. I mean, you can Google every bone saw that existed at the time, but it was the strength of the people who really made it happen when you realize they had to overcome personal prejudice about gender and race, let alone the lack of experience. So, so anyway, so the documentary, yes, I'm working on it. It's 4 1-hour programs. Hopefully within the next 12 to 18 months, you'll be able to see it. The scripts have been completed and it's going to be more than 3,000 still images. It's inspired by Ken Burns' Civil War series, but it is, you can look online, there's a 5-minute trailer. That is almost exclusively the photographs, his series. Mine is a lot of the graphic art. It's more colorful and it's a different focus, but it's just an incredible story, and it's a story about the best of Americans, and that's the story I want to tell.
I love that. I think if anybody else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I think I can ask one more. Did your research spark any special interest in any historical figures? I know you touched on a couple of them there. But if there's any additional ones that you really sort of deep dived into.
The ones who knocked my socks off.
Yeah.
You know, I tell their stories in the book. I mean, there was one, Phoebe Pember, Phoebe Yates Levy Pember, who became the head of Chimborazo Hospital, the largest hospital in the South, 8,000 beds, this hospital. And she was a very classy woman, a widow, and she was tough. And they hated having her in there at first. But there's one story, Phoebe, people were always stealing the medicinal liquor. And she caught somebody in the storeroom one day, and she had a hidden gun. And she said, "You better put that down, because I have a gun and this room is too small for even a woman to miss 6 times." So I love Phoebe Pember. I do, the 13 doctors, the 13 African-American doctors, who most of whom went to school in Canada or in Europe, were just incredible people. And so I guess they really stayed with me. The book is really a collection of those heroic Americans.
That's excellent. I love that. There's another question. Were female nurses similarly active in the Confederacy?
Yes, yes. There was equal compassion and passion on both sides of that. And the Confederacy just had so many fewer people. I mean, that it did not have the strength. But the Confederate women had volunteer organizations. They had nothing that was as large as like the United States Sanitary Commission in the North, but it really was the numbers. But the Confederate women, my best Confederate women story is after the Battle of Shiloh, one of the first really big ones in the South. 40 women who had probably never been more than a mile or 2 from their homes got together. They got on a train and they went to Shiloh with a chaperone. And when they got there, they went to the first hospital they got to volunteer their aid for all these victims of terrible violence. And the doctor who was the head of the hospital came out and he refused them entrance. He said, no more women or flies will be admitted. So they went to the next hospital, which let them in. So those Southern ladies were every bit as tough as and dedicated as the Northern women. And I tell their stories in the book too.
Awesome.
I
That's
tried
great.
to go back and forth and give an equal picture. So
Yeah, that's so awesome. Are there any other questions that people want to get in to the chat now before we end the session? Someone said this is an amazing session. Thank you for sharing this with us. So I think that's a great way to end it. Carole, thank you so much. This was an awesome session, and thank you for everything you shared with us tonight.
oh, thank you, Emma.